once for yes.
I am Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
The world seems to be turning ever faster as it's spooky season once again. When the dark nights roll in early and fade away late, the mornings are chill and crisp. Fog wallows across the land, and the dew sparkles on cobwebs both real and decorative.
Of course, in many ways, it's spooky season all year round at KOFY HQ, and whereas most creators save up their creepiest content, especially for October, we tell ghost stories all year round. So, for this, our 7th year podcasting and our 7th Hallowbirthdayween episode, we thought we'd do something a little bit different. This episode, we're diving into Premonitions and Prophecies. So, Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up. The future you wish to know. I see. Let me gaze into my crystal ball and tell your future. Well, I don't believe it. It looks like the Paranormal Radar is being resurrected from its early grave, as we have a story about the sole practitioner of a form of divinatory magic. I can see something. A vegetable. Must be a pumpkin or turnip, surely? No, it's something else. I see stories. So many stories of premonitions from Paul, Kelly, Sarah and Bea. And more do I see. Of visions from the past about the future as we travel all the way up to Yorkshire to visit the home of a prophetess in a cave by the river Nidd and learn her petrifying story.
Oh, you had a little bit of a fortune-telling Yoda thing going on at the beginning there.
I did. He seemed to be the obvious choice.
I would like to see a fortune-telling Yoda. That'd be cool. But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a huge thank you to Sheepish Gnome for making a donation via KOFY to us.
Thank you so much, as always, to all of our patrons and KOFY supporters. It is you guys who make this show possible and enable us to continue searching out ghost stories and legends from all over England and share them with all of you. And we are so incredibly grateful.
We also want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has supported us in other ways over the years as well. I know I say this every year, but I can't quite believe we've reached our 7th birthday. And the fact that we have is because of you guys, our lovely listeners. We know that times are tough and not everyone can support us financially, but every time you listen, every time you download an episode or comment on an Instagram post or like a YouTube video, tell a friend about our show or send in a ghost story, you're helping massively. And we wouldn't still be doing this after 7 years if it wasn't for every single one of you and every single time you've done any one of those things. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you. We have the most incredible listenership in the world. I truly, truly believe that. And now, rather fittingly for Halloween perhaps, the Paranormal Radar has risen from its early grave to bring us a chilling story about vegetables?
So, as we've mentioned, this episode we're looking into premonitions and prophecy, and in particular prophetesses. And we have exactly that in our Paranormal Radar story this episode. It comes from the Devon Live website, which is a little odd, as it appears the prophetess featured in the story is actually from Worcestershire. It's also a little older than our usual Paranormal Radar stories, as it was originally published in September of 2022. Though, on the plus side, that does give us an opportunity to check some of the Oracle's predictions for 2023. The story focuses on Jemima Packington, who claims to be able to foretell the future. She has so far apparently correctly predicted Brexit, Boris Johnson's rise to the premiership, and Theresa May's exit from number 10. She also claims to have predicted the deaths of both Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth. In another, more recent article, Jemima states that she has between a 75 and 90% accuracy rate. Impressive stuff indeed. Now you might be wondering how Jemima makes her stunningly accurate predictions. Well, I can let you know that she is in fact the sole practitioner of the art of asparamancy. I was entirely unfamiliar with the ancient art of asparamancy until I read this article, but the cover photo somewhat gave it away, and it is in fact in the title, to be fair. But for those of you already going, no, really? Jemima claims to make her predictions by casting stalks of asparagus. And not just any asparagus either, only freshly cut stems from the Vale of Evesham will do. Luckily, that's the UK's main supplier of asparagus, so it isn't in short supply. It does leave me with a few questions though, like, is asparamancy a seasonal ability? Anyway, Jemima, dubbed Mystic Veg by the newspapers, casts her stalks of asparagus and interprets the results to come up with her predictions, an ability which she suspects was passed down to her from her grandmother, who used to read tea leaves as her divinatory flora of choice. I joke, but I'm honestly not sure why I find asparagus more amusing than tea leaves as a divination method.
I don't know. You're right, you probably shouldn't, but it's just so much funnier.
It is an amusing story. Now, she starts strong in describing her practice by talking about her prediction of the death of the Queen, who passed away in September of last year. And when she cast her stalks months before, she saw a broken crown which foretold great sadness for the royal family. However, it was only later, she said, when she saw photographs of the Queen welcoming Liz Truss as the new Prime Minister, that she noticed how frail the Queen appeared, and thought back to her earlier prediction and made the connection. It's worth noting that this event was only 2 days before the Queen passed away. Amazing as her prediction of the death of a 96-year-old was, it seems that her 75 to 90% success rate might need to be taken with a pinch of salt, and viewed through powerful hindsight glasses. She seems to have a bit of a thing for Boris Johnson too, predicting that he would stay in power following his succession of scandals, when he was in fact ousted from number 10, that he would return to the premiership following the exit of Liz Truss, when that did in fact not happen, and she's still holding out hope for a Boris bounce back. She had a go at sport, predicting that Manchester City would fail to win the Premier League, only they did, and that Croatia would win the World Cup, hint they did not. She also flubbed on the cricket, predicting a win for England in the Cricket World Cup, and in rugby she pegged England to win the Women's World Cup, when that honour went to New Zealand. With her success rate seemingly failing to live up to expectations, she's given a few more predictions, only now they're oddly somewhat less specific. For instance, she's predicting that someone in politics will be accused of corruption this year. No kidding. She also reckons that some Hollywood stars will come out as gay, and there will be some celebrity deaths. Hold my coffee, darling, whilst I rush to the bookies. Other gems include that people would celebrate King Charles's coronation, and that climate change would continue to be a concern. How does she do it? I'm at a loss. And if you'd like to learn a little more about Mystic Veg, as usual, I'll put the links to the articles I've mentioned in the show notes on the website.
Oh, sorry, I'm dying over here. I'm just dying. The thing is, it's not actually that much more ridiculous than, well, there's loads of divinatory methods, so many different ones you can use. And honestly, I believe that all of them come down to just being a tool to tap into your intuition. I would never normally laugh so hard at something like this. Whatever works for you, honestly, whatever divinatory method works for you, if it allows you to tap into your unconscious, that is completely fine. There is just something I can't get over that is so hilarious about it being asparagus.
The thing is, like, my first thought was like rune staves, like literally just sticks you cast on the ground, and it seems very similar to that, but just the idea of it being asparagus just comes over as being very silly.
I just can't get over it. Okay, I think I've pulled myself together. Well, it wouldn't be Hallowbirthdayween without a slightly ridiculous, tangentially paranormal news story, would it? But now it is story time, and we're going to dive into some more serious tales of premonitions. Long-time listeners may remember that we made an episode featuring true tales of listeners' premonition experiences before. And ever since then, we've been saving up any such stories for another themed episode. Well, I'm happy to tell you that that time is now, and the first story is from Paul.
Several years ago, I went on a snowboarding trip with my then girlfriend in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. We stayed overnight in the inn at Jim Thorpe, in the town of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. The inn was originally built in the 1830s, burnt down a little over a decade later, and was rebuilt. It hosted many famous people throughout the late 19th century, only to fall into decline during the Great Depression. I did not know it at the time, but it's thought to be extremely haunted. After my experiences there, I'm certainly convinced. That night, I was restless and unable to sleep, so told my girlfriend that I was going to take a walk and explore the hotel. Each floor featured historical photographs highlighting the town's and the inn's history, and I was interested in having a look at them. At some point during my exploration, I began to get an uneasy feeling that someone was walking behind me. I could hear what sounded like muffled footsteps and looked over my shoulder expecting to see someone making their way down the hall. Not seeing anyone, I assumed it was noises from the guest rooms and put it out of my mind. On one of the floors, I began to distinctly smell the unmistakable odour of cigar smoke. The smell seemed to follow me down the halls and did not fade even as I descended floors. I should point out that at no point did I have the feeling that I was being stalked by anything malicious, but it was more as if I was being regarded with a kind of curiosity. It did make me feel uneasy, however. I decided to go outside to get some fresh air. It was cold and quiet, much as you would expect in a small Pennsylvania mountain town in the middle of winter. But the atmosphere felt close, and somehow not quite real. Almost like what I'd imagine being on a movie set of a small town built on a soundstage must feel like. Real enough in appearance, but slightly off and artificial. At this point, I'd been wandering for over an hour, so decided to try and get some rest. I got back to the room to find my girlfriend fast asleep, obviously unbothered by any feelings of strangeness. At some point, I finally fell asleep and had a dream about waking up in a hospital bed. I'm not usually a person who remembers my dreams, but this one stuck with me. The next day, while snowboarding, I fell and was knocked unconscious, suffering a concussion and some minor injuries. The first clear memory I have after the accident is waking up in a hospital bed, in a scene very similar to what I had dreamed the night before. I have had other unexplained experiences before that may or may not be paranormal. Strange sounds, glimpses of figures out of the corner of my eye, etc. But nothing so vivid, prolonged, or in this case, prophetic. All these years later, I can't help but wonder, was someone trying to get my attention to warn me of the impending accident?
Thank you so much to Paul for sharing that experience with us. And this is a really interesting one because it's not just a premonition, there's other stuff going on there as well.
Yeah, that was weird, like being followed through the hotel and the feeling he had when he was outside. It sounds very similar to experiences that we've had before.
Yeah.
And I hadn't explained it in quite that way, but I felt exactly what he meant when he said that.
Yeah, when he was describing it, I could recall in my mind times when I'd been in places and felt like that kind of slightly offness of the area. And I can definitely see how you could relate that to perhaps being on a movie set. So I'm wondering, there's a couple of possibilities going on here. He mentions, was somebody trying to warn him of the impending accident? So that's one possibility. The other possibility I can think of, especially because of this feeling of something being off, feeling of otherness, feeling of this strange atmosphere, was that he was just in, I'm going to say it, and if you play the liminal place drinking game, get your shots ready. Is it a case of it being a bit of a liminal place? And so it was easier for this kind of paranormal activity to come through, for maybe different time and space to kind of bleed through into our reality. And could that have meant that he was more in touch with his own subconscious and when he was able to tap into this premonition where in a different location he wouldn't have been?
See, I was wondering whether it was more time slip maybe, because a lot of those tend to talk about how things feel odd and go quiet. And
I see what you're saying, but then how does that tie into the premonition?
Well, either he's in the future and he's sleeping and sort of half remembering what's happened to him in the bit that he doesn't quite remember. It's all a bit weird, and my skeptic hat has been sort of washed and destroyed and thrown out the door at this point.
Well, it's the Hallowbirthdayween episode.
It is. If you can't...
Skeptic hats are off today.
Yeah, if you can't throw your skeptic hat away for one day a year, then what's
the
life
point?
for?
Well, that's a really interesting one, Paul, and that's going to keep us scratching our heads for some time.
Now, we may well have temporarily thrown our skeptic hat out the window and into the wind, but one of our listeners hasn't. And this story is from Sarah.
I consider myself a skeptic and agnostic about all things spiritual or supernatural. I've never used a Ouija board and I don't seek out paranormal experiences. When I hear of other people's experiences, I generally look for a logical explanation, and on most occasions, I can think of one. That doesn't mean I don't thoroughly enjoy hearing the stories. It just takes a lot for me to admit that I can't find a reasonable explanation. You've both mentioned before that you find it amusing that some of the strangest tales come from people professing to be a skeptic. I think the reason for this is that people, including myself, feel that it's important to establish at the beginning whether you're the type of person who wants to see the supernatural in something that is merely unusual. I am not that type of person. And yet, throughout my life, I've had several experiences that no matter how hard I try, I cannot come up with a reasonable explanation for them. There have almost always been witnesses to my experiences, and until right now, I haven't widely shared them, save with these witnesses or family. Lil, in episode 2, you said that you thought seeing premonitions must be a terrible gift, because one can't tell if a dream is a premonition or not until after the event takes place, and the receiver doesn't seem to be able to alter future events. Well, I'd like to assure you that it is possible to know which dreams are premonitions and which aren't, and it is possible to change the outcome of events. I know this because it's happened to me. The first time I had one was in early summer before my final year of secondary high school. In the dream, I entered a high school on the first day in September. It looked different from my high school and was completely empty, which was odd for the first day of school. As I stood in the front entrance, feeling a bit bewildered, a staff person came out of the office and told me that the first day of school was tomorrow, not today, and I had arrived a day early. The dream was so vivid that I told my friend about it in all its details. I felt strongly that I was seeing a real event, and for several days I couldn't stop thinking about it. However, as I'd never had one of these premonitions before, I eventually stopped thinking about it and forgot it. About a month later, my parents announced that we were moving to another town. This came as a great shock as they hadn't spoken of it, and it was only a week before school started for my final year. That week was absolute chaos, packing and moving to our new home. Before this sudden move, I'd been all set for my last year, registered in my courses and looking forward to the first day on Tuesday. With the move happening so suddenly, I didn't have time to register for classes or even visit my new school. The plan was to speak with a counsellor on my first day and to select whatever classes were available. When Tuesday arrived, I set off for school. Well, as we're talking about premonitions, I don't need to tell you what happened next. It was exactly as it happened in the dream. I recognised the interior of the school instantly, and even the staff person who came out to speak with me. They informed me that although my old school started on Tuesday, this district started a day later. When I got home, I immediately called my friend that I had described the dream to earlier that summer. Both of us were amazed and completely baffled. That was my first experience, and it was this dream that taught me to recognise which dreams are premonitions and which aren't. Premonition dreams are not like normal dreams. When one begins, it feels almost as though someone or something is shaking me awake within my dream. I become aware that I'm dreaming and feel completely lucid within a vividly real dream state. It feels as though someone or something is trying to show me something important. I have the strong understanding that I'm seeing future events. When I awake, it is suddenly and with a pounding heart, urgently needing to write down the details or tell someone. Every time I have had one of these dreams, I have recognised it as seeing future events, and every time I've had one, it has come true in all its detail. One of these dreams occurred while I was travelling through Spain. It was during a 3-month peregrination through the UK, parts of Europe and Morocco. I had never travelled through these locations before, so had no way of knowing what each place looked like until I arrived there. As this occurred over 20 years ago, I didn't have the internet or any way to see what places looked like. I was working my way up the coast and stopped in Tarragona. My next stop was to be Barcelona. It was my last night in Tarragona that I had the dream. In the dream, I was walking down a lane with a new friend that I hadn't met yet. The lane was in a city that I hadn't visited yet, but I saw both in rich detail, from the details of his face to the colour of the stones on the path and the type of buildings beside me. As we walked, we became aware of a danger behind us. With rising dread and fear, we sensed a group of men following at a distance, and we felt we weren't safe. Suddenly, from behind us came a great noise and the snarl of an animal, as well as bounding footsteps. Both of us flew around to see what came for us at the same instant that a large animal pounced towards us with a menacing growl. The animal was a large dog, but looked strange with orange and black tiger stripes and orange eyes. A split second later, it had leapt between us and continued off racing down the street after a cat. At the same time, the group behind us had turned away from us down another street. We both felt such a wave of relief wash over us that we started to laugh, let down our guard, and relaxed. During this time that we both had let our guards down, a man came up behind us and stole our bags, containing most of our important belongings, money, and passports. When I had this dream, it was the same as the others, waking from it with heart hammering, urgently needing to write down the details. I knew that someone or something was warning me that when these events occur, I must remain vigilant and not let down my guard, or I'll be robbed. I wrote the whole dream in my journal that I still have to this day. About a week later, I'd arrived in Barcelona, and while checking into my room, looked up beside me, and lo and behold, there was my companion from my dream. I introduced myself and we became friends quite quickly, deciding to visit a few tourist spots that day. A few hours into the morning, I knew I had to tell him about the dream. I was reluctant to do so, as I knew how strange this would sound to him. But eventually, I did tell him in as much detail as I could. He was fairly open-minded about it and curious, especially as I told him that he was the friend in my dream a week before I ever met him. Later that evening, we took a different route back to the city centre, on a road neither of us had travelled. As we walked down the road, I recognised it from my dream. I said, "Okay, the dream is starting now." I reiterated each event that would be happening, from the following group of men to the dog chasing the cat. And within minutes, each event occurred in precise detail. Even the dog with the strange orange eyes and tiger stripes. When it was over and we were both feeling that wash of relief, I said, "Okay now, we've not to let our guards down. We have to watch our bags because somebody is going to try and steal them." At that point, any doubts he may have harboured had vanished. He asked me, "When will the robbery attempt happen?" And I replied that I didn't know exactly when, but it would be soon, within the next few hours. Sure enough, a few hours later, that exact thing did happen. As we were prepared, we'd tied the straps of our bags down, so that when the would-be thief tried to yank them away, they found they couldn't and quickly abandoned their effort. I realised that over time memories can change and become embellished, but that is not so in this case. Although it happened 20 years ago, it was so shocking that every moment of it was printed indelibly in my memory. Not only that, but as I kept a journal at the time documenting both at the time of the dream and after the events took place, in a journal that I still have to this day, as well as having a witness to the events. I've had a handful since then, sometimes separated by years. The latest one was a dream I had around the 2019-2020 New Year, about all the events that would take place in 2020, including a global pandemic, where the pandemic would originate, shortages, and the sad events that took place in the US during the year. It was very detailed, very dark, and very frightening. My husband has witnessed a few of these dreams in the past, and so although he is an atheist and utter skeptic, he trusted me. As he has some health issues which would mean quarantine for us should a global pandemic occur, we were able to plan for the year, prepare for lockdown, stock up on supplies before there was ever a mention of a pandemic. I must say it was odd to watch the event unfold, and with each event to know what else was coming down the line. I mentioned at the start, I'm not the kind of person to go looking for unusual experiences. Each event happened out of the blue and unprovoked. And until now, I haven't shared them with anyone save the other witnesses or my husband. I recognise that if I heard someone tell of these experiences, I would simply have a very hard time believing them, so I've chosen to keep quiet. In telling them now, I have no vested interest in convincing anyone, save to hear your thoughts and if you could shed any light on them. If not, these will remain my own experiences, in the shadowy basement of my memory where I store these things I can't explain.
I have only one word for those, and that is wow.
I know.
That is amazing.
That wasn't even everything. Sarah actually shared more experiences with us, but this was already becoming such a long episode. We wanted to save them for a follow-up episode. So keep your ears tuned for those. They're not premonitions, they're paranormal ones. So we thought we'd spread it over a couple of episodes.
Yeah, we're sticking to premonitions this time, and If you happen to have a premonition again, let us know, especially if it includes lottery numbers, that sort of thing.
It's such a... I mean, that's really good to know. As she mentions at the beginning, when we did our first Premonitions episode, I actually felt a little bit upset because so many of them were from people who had premonitions about accidents and because they didn't have the number of experiences that she has had, they couldn't differentiate them from a normal dream.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know there were premonitions, or even if they had an inkling, they just didn't, they couldn't act upon them.
Yeah.
It seemed like they couldn't change the outcome. So it's really comforting to hear from somebody who has been able to discern the difference and who has, taken the forethought to write everything down or share it with somebody so that they can come back to it years later and think, well, no, actually, I'm not, my memory is not playing tricks on me here. That really is as clear as it felt. And more importantly, to act on them, to get prepared and be able to change, well, maybe just change the future outcome, or at least, prepare for it, be ready for it.
Yeah, that was amazing. Like, I wonder what would have happened if they had taken your bags, because it's bad enough anywhere, but if you're in a foreign country, you lose your passport.
That's awful.
And all your money is such a huge deal, especially back then when you didn't have sort of digital communication, and that would have been an absolute nightmare and could have literally put your life on a different course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any one of those things could have put your life on a different course, to be perfectly honest.
So yeah, butterfly effect, wonder what would happen. But hopefully we're in the right timeline and everything turned out as it should. I'm presuming that is what the premonition was for, to put right what once went wrong.
Are we going quantum leap here, are we?
We are quantum leaping here, yeah.
Wow, we're all over the place this episode. Skeptic's hat's gone, we're in quantum leap, fortune-telling Yoda, it's all going on. But yeah, as she says at the beginning, this is one of those where... what other explanation can you possibly find for it? I know we've been joking today about throwing our skeptic hats out the window, and we are obviously people who do seek out the paranormal, and we want things to be paranormal experiences, but we do try and put the skeptic hat on sometimes. And if there is a reasonable alternative explanation for things that isn't something paranormal, we do always try and consider it. But in this case, there is none. There couldn't possibly be.
No, there's kind of levels. The amount of times I think, okay, I can't think of a solution to this, but I'm not the brainiest person on the planet. I'm sure there are reasons that I'm just not thinking of. But this kind of feels like one of those where it's like, I don't think anybody, no matter how intelligent they are, could come up with a reason.
No.
It gets down to the things that make your brain ache, like determinism and free will. Is it possible to have free will? And if you know everything about the universe, could you predict the future? And it's just even if you had a supercomputer that could do that, I don't think it would be necessarily that.
I'm not sure. I'm just not sure that there's a way to reasonably find an alternate explanation for this one. It's just one of those incredible stories that, like you say, just makes your brain ache from the sheer number of possibilities. Yeah,
it's almost different when it's somewhere as well. When you can I dreamt I went shopping and I dreamt I ran into Fred and I dreamt this. Whereas this is somewhere you'd never been, with a person you'd never met, on a fairly outlandish situation that most people are probably unlikely to encounter.
It's the little details as well, like the dog with the stripes. It's just, I can, in a lot of cases, when I think I've had deja vu, or when I think I've had that odd feeling of is this a dream or is this something more? You can kind of explain it away a lot of the times by your brain infilling the gaps. It's like, when you're used to having pets, and then when you look at a blank space, your brain fills it in with a cat or a dog or whatever you're used to seeing. But when you get down to really specific, unusual details like that, how on earth could your brain have just thrown that out of nowhere?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense to me.
So yeah, I'm afraid we have no real answers for you.
No,
I know you asked if we had
sorry.
any light to shed, and I'm absolutely gobsmacked.
Yeah. No matter how much we dust off our skeptics' hats for this one, I just don't think they're going to cut it.
Well, and I always say that, a skeptic, the best generally they can do is say, I don't know. So
Absolutely.
donning my skeptic hat very, very quickly, just very tiny portion of this episode, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I would know.
No, and to be honest, though, these are, for me, the most exciting paranormal moments you can hope for when you try and look at it from all angles and just come to the conclusion that you absolutely do not know what on earth is going on.
Just means you've got more to learn.
Exactly. And that's very exciting. Well, thank you once again to Sarah for sharing those amazing experiences with us. And we look forward to sharing her other experiences in a future episode. But for now, we have another premonition story from Kelly.
I served as a police officer between 2004 and 2014, and part of our role involved attending sudden or unexpected deaths outside of the hospital or medical setting. This is quite routine, and we're the initial representative of the coroner. In my time, I'd attended many situations like this, and whilst always sad, there was never anything that was out of the ordinary for me. I arrived, spoke with the family, and completed the necessary paperwork for the coroner. I'll be honest, I'd never experienced death until joining the police, and I always struggled to go to a sudden death. I realise now it's probably because I'm a sponge for others' emotions, and I just wanted to hug everyone. One such attendance does stand out, though. It was around 2008, and I was working the early shifts over the weekend. I went to bed on Saturday night and had a really vivid dream about attending a sudden death at work. In my dream, I could see the front door, then the person who had passed away in their bed, but not their face or gender, and a detailed layout of the living room where the bed was also situated. My dream progressed to me sat with the family having a brew in the kitchen and completing paperwork. The dream itself was actually quite nice as it felt quite peaceful. Sunday morning, I arrived in briefing at 7 a.m. and I was allocated a sudden death that had happened in the last hour. I arrived at the front door of the house, knocked and was invited inside. Before they answered the door, I have to admit I started to feel like I'd been here before. Upon entering the house, the living room in my dream unfolded before me, right down to the bunch of lilies stood in the fireplace, the TV to my right, the sofa, the chair, and of course the deceased to my left in their bed. I said good morning to the family and to the deceased lady, it seemed rude not to, and was invited into the kitchen for a brew and to do my paperwork, just like in the dream. I actually had an amazing conversation with the family. I think they supported me more than I did them. Their mum had passed after a short illness, and they were so accepting of this it left me feeling very calm about dealing with sudden deaths from then on. I have to say that I regularly dreamed about work things, but it was usually my brain trying to process what my day had involved, but never anything as vivid and real as this.
And thank you so much to Kelly for sharing that experience with us. And another really positive one, or I know it's quite a sad topic, obviously, being called to a sudden death, but it obviously changed the way Kelly felt about attending those sudden deaths going forwards.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, at first this appears to be like an awful story, like, oh, sudden death, first thing in the morning, but there's
actually a really comforting experience.
Yeah, there's that sort of, first of all, you've had the night before this dream that's like, don't worry, you're going to have this thing to deal with, but it's going to be fine. They're going to be welcoming, you're going to do your job and everything's going to be fine. But she also says she was left with this sort of long-term, not appreciation, but long-term ability to deal with these situations better.
Yeah, it was like it helped her make a bit of a peace with it when it had been something that she'd been really concerned and nervous about beforehand.
Yeah, I think anybody would.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's definitely a nice, like, it doesn't have to be awful.
It's another one of those, though, and this is why a lot of these premonition stories get me. I can understand why you might have a premonition about an accident or, you know, something that was like a tragedy coming to pass so that you could maybe do something about it. But sometimes, well, quite often actually, we hear premonition stories that are something quite ordinary. Like, this is quite ordinary. And the only experience I've had with a premonition in my life was not just ordinary, but verging on being silly, to be perfectly honest. It was, I can't remember, I probably told this story in the last premonition episode we did, but it was just about getting up in front of the school hall and performing something that, like, was absolutely not something I was prone to doing at that age at all. And it was something or is the only premonition I've ever had. And it was something so ordinary that it just seems, why that?
I don't know, and you say ordinary, like, I would find that awfully stressful. And I think, you know, again, going to a situation like this would be awfully stressful.
Yes.
And is it just, don't worry, you're going to get through this. It's going to be as fine. It's not going to be as bad as you're worried about.
Yeah, in this case, I can definitely see that you could assign more purpose to it if you wanted to. Definitely, it could have happened to help Kelly get past that fear and worry, and it's just such a lovely, comforting experience.
And that wasn't the only experience that Kelly shared, but like we've heard on the last listener story, we're going to save those for another occasion.
Yep. And in fact, you'll be hearing that again very shortly, because for our final story of the episode, we also have another listener who sent us in quite a few paranormal experiences, but the first one was a premonition. So we're going to play that one for you now, because we've got a little bit of a treat. She's actually reading it to us, which we always love so much. And then we'll save the rest of the experiences for a future episode. This is from B.
The first thing is, I don't remember this, but I was told about this, is when I was a tiny toddler, I think, in our first house in Warrington. Apparently, my mum and dad heard me screaming one night and they kind of came running up. What's up? What's up? And I was standing in my cot, kind of talking. It must have been kind of nonsensical because I was quite young. But I think I was saying to them, there's a man in my room. There's a man in my room. And my parents were like, okay, no, there's nobody here. What's up? What's up? And I was like, no, he's gone. He's gone. And they're, oh God, right, well, tell us about it. And I was like, well, at first he was nice, but then he was nasty. Apparently I said to them, or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing. And they were like, oh my God, okay, what happened? What happened? Because they were like checking the windows. There's no way anyone could have got in. And they said, what did he say to you? And I was like, apparently I said to them, he said, don't buy the house. There's going to be a fire. And mum and dad were like, okay, that's really weird, because apparently they were looking at buying a new house at the time. I'm not really sure what happened after that. This has all just been recounted to me. But then maybe a week or two later, not very long after, there was a fire in our house that we were currently living in. And my parents were able to use the insurance money to buy a much better house, they say, or to put towards a much better house, or put a deposit down. I'm a little foggy on the details. But anyway, it actually happened. There was a fire in our house. We were all okay, thankfully. But then they'd been looking at a house that I think maybe they weren't sure about, or they had a bad feeling about, or something. And it just all turned out really well. And as I had said, the man had said. So that was the first one.
Thank you so much to B. And I'm sorry to everybody for leaving you all on tenterhooks, wondering what happens to B next. We will be sharing that with you very soon, but we couldn't wait to share her premonition story in this special themed episode.
It was a really interesting one as well. Like
another really positive one as well.
Like that it turned out well in the end. And whether or not, this is the thing, I'm interested to know whether or not she actually changed something by mentioning it.
I mean, how could you not? And this kind of comes back to one of the details that I found really interesting about her being quite little, probably just a toddler. And as such a small child, to come out with something like, don't buy the house, there's going to be a fire. I mean, if I was that child's parent, I couldn't, even if I wanted to believe there was something completely, a completely normal explanation, no matter how much I wanted to believe that, I just don't think you could stop that playing in the back of your mind, because what possible reason could a toddler have to come out with something like that?
Yeah, I've almost got like a story running in my head when you said, at first he was nice and then he was mean, and like the information that was given, and I'm kind of saying like what was actually said, and I've just got this again. Skeptic hat's gone. Just I'm
it's in the wind.
Yeah, I'm replaying this scenario in my head of basically someone trying to get a message across to the parents.
And getting frustrated.
Can't get through to the parents. Okay, I've got to deal with a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Like, how do I get? Don't worry, don't buy the other house. It's not the one you want. You're going to get the insurance money for the fire that happens at your house. Everybody's going to be fine.
How do you get that through to a toddler?
Yeah. And the toddler's just like, okay, don't buy a house. Fire. And it's like, no, you've got to tell them that it's going to be fine. Like the insurance money is going to cover the fire. It's
so you're
getting frustrated.
You're basically thinking, perhaps not. I mean, it would come off feeling mean to a toddler, probably. If somebody was getting frustrated, not being able to get their point across, but maybe not. Maybe that behaviour wasn't coming from a mean place.
Yeah.
Actually trying to be helpful.
That's what I was thinking. Like, first he was nice. It's like, I've got something really important to tell you that's going to be really good. And of course, trying to explain insurance cover to a 3-year-old probably didn't go down so well. But again, that's me playing the scenario in my head. So.
Wow, yeah, your skeptic hat is gone and buried
I've
today.
dived into the woo today. I'm swimming deep in the pool of woo.
Hallowbirthdayween, it's got to be done. Well, thank you so much to Bea once again for sharing that experience with us, and we can't wait to share the rest of her stories.
And that is the end of today's Premonition stories. Thank you so much to everyone who shared their experiences with us today. We're honoured to be entrusted with their sharing, and we hope we did justice to them and you. If anyone listening has a story they would like to share, premonition or otherwise, please do get in touch. Your stories are the lifeblood of this show, and we would love to hear them. And we may still have some premonition stories squirreled away, so there may be another themed episode to come in future. But we're not done yet. It's time to dust off your crystal balls, shuffle your tarot cards, and grab your asparagus stalks as we take you on a journey to meet the prophetess of Yorkshire, Mother Shipton.
Last episode, we talked about King Charles, the Civil War, healing wells, and a lot of pubs, including one called the World's End. But for this episode, we wanted to do something completely different. So we darted off on a 6-hour round trip to a totally different part of England to visit something that very much wasn't a pub. In fact, wasn't even a building. So imagine our surprise when we started our research proper and ended up coming across King Charles, the Civil War, healing wells, and a pub called the World's End. The universe certainly has a sense of humour sometimes. On this trip, though, the World's End pub isn't named quite as metaphorically. This one is talking about the actual end of the world, because today we're talking about prophecies, or more specifically, a prophetess, a very famous prophetess from Yorkshire, known as Mother Shipton. It was a dark and stormy night. Yes, I know we've done this before, but there's a good reason for the existence of tropes like these. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the very existence of that trope owes quite a lot to this particular story, as famous as it became. In fact, we'll meet quite a few classic tropes, and maybe even the origins of them in this journey. But for now, let's start at the beginning, in a small, damp cave deep in the tangled trees of Knaresborough Forest. The rain pelts down through the tree canopy, making muddy rivers underfoot, rainwater gushing down the steep sides of the gorge towards the rapidly swelling River Nidd. A midwife slips on the slick mud and nearly goes slithering down the gorge herself, catching at a sodden branch for balance, as the sky overhead groans and rumbles as though in dread of some fearful calamity about to come to pass. Finding the small fissure in the rock where Agatha Sonthale shelters, already in the throes of labour, the two women tremble as the sky is split asunder with searing blazes of lightning. And under that crude, rocky outcrop, a baby girl is brought into the world as the sky roars, the trees whip viciously in an unearthly wind, and under the first cries of the infant Ursula Sonthale, the midwife thought she heard... It must be the noise of the howling storm, but she swore it sounded like cackling. Well, that all sounds very Victorian and melodramatic, doesn't it? But in fact, this story goes back a lot longer than that, definitely back to at least the 17th century and those precarious years leading up to the advent of civil war, and maybe back as far as the Tudors, even before Henry VIII was on the throne. Back to 1488, when baby Ursula was born into a world where civil war was not yet a glint in a soothsayer's eye, Henry VII was on the throne, and the monasteries were still intact. And to follow this story, we need to head to Yorkshire, straight up the Great North Road to a little town called Knaresborough, nestled between the great city of York and the spa town of Harrogate, and find out how baby Ursula Sonthale grew up into the famed prophetess, Mother Shipton. In Tudor times, Harrogate became known for its healing wells and mineral waters, after a member of the local gentry called William Slingsby drank from a spring in High Harrogate and recognised that the water was similar to the mineral water he had taken at the town of Spa in Belgium, a place known as early as the 1300s for its chalybeate iron salt springs, which were believed to have healing and health-giving properties. In the ensuing years, more mineral springs were found in High Harrogate, and in Low Harrogate, a sulphur spring. And before long, the waters were being touted as the cure for everything from scurvy to epilepsy, and people were flocking from all over the country to drink and bathe in them, even the sulphur water, which apparently smelt and tasted foul. Inns and lodging houses were built to accommodate the visitors, furnished with wooden tubs for them to bathe in the heated spring water. Eventually, as the centuries went on, other entertainments were laid on. A racecourse, cafes, a ballroom, so that guests could make the most of an extended visit. And Harrogate became a fashionable place for the wealthy to visit during the social season that happened over the summer months in the run-up to the upper classes' daughters being presented to the King and Queen at court in London. And a really fashionable thing to do as part of that season was to visit the nearby town of Knaresborough, just under 5 miles west from Harrogate, and make a walk through Knaresborough Forest to visit another spring with even more mysterious powers at what is claimed to be the oldest tourist attraction in England, a petrifying well that turned everything the water touched into stone, and just happened to have a very famous story attached to it. And that's where we head one fine autumn day, driving 150 miles up the Great North Road to the stunning landscape of the Nidd Gorge. The 120-foot-high gorge was carved out of sandstone 12,000 years ago during the last ice age, today leaving a steeply sided river valley, the banks wooded with the remains of a medieval royal hunting forest. We park up next to the River Nidd, in what has to be one of, if not the most picturesque car parks we've ever been in. On our side of the river, a thick tree line of tall oak, beech, ash, and rare hornbeam screens what lies beyond, keeping our ultimate destination hidden from us for a bit longer. On the other side of the river, houses sprout out of the sheer face of the steep gorge in layers, like some kind of fanciful cake. And for the cherry on top, A castle ruin juts raggedly up from the top of the cliff. The width of the river is spanned by a tremendous 78-foot-high railway viaduct, a Victorian structure, but oddly, it's been made to look like a medieval castle, with crenellations, turrets, and even faux arrow slits decorating the supporting columns. Pretty rowing boats dot the water, oars enthusiastically wielded by some hardy souls braving the autumn chill, making for a very tranquil scene. But only a few metres further downstream, the Nidd thunders over a double-level weir opposite an old paper mill, leaving us in no doubt that, pretty as it may be, the river this settlement likely grew up around still very much holds sway here. The Gatehouse Lodge we drive past on our way in, where our tickets are checked and we're armed with guidebooks and maps, is painted all over in a black and white checkerboard pattern, a trend we can see in other buildings along the valley as we cast our eyes about. A cafe over the bridge we drove in on is painted the same, and down by the waterside so is an old rambling manor house, even the chimneys having been treated to the black and white chessboard finish. It seems no one really knows exactly why the first building was painted with the black and white checkerboard pattern, although they do know with which building it began. The oldest part of that rambling manor by the waterside is actually a wood-framed hunting lodge built in the year 1208 by King John, and incredibly survives to this day. Even more incredibly, the story goes that it stands where it does because the king loved hunting in Knaresborough Forest so much that he would frequently leave his retinue down on the riverbank under a huge old oak tree. In fact, it became such a frequent occurrence that he built a hunting lodge there, with the tree inside it. Apparently, he built it right around the oak tree using some of the substantial branches for rafters, and although these beams have long since been replaced, the roots and trunk are reported to still remain in the house to this day. A wooden cupboard concealing part of the trunk downstairs, whilst upstairs the stump sticks right out of the landing floor. This I would have loved to have seen, but the house is privately owned, and sadly I haven't even been able to find a photo of the tree in a cupboard to marvel at or share. Aside from the amazing tree in a cupboard, it's also a shame you can't visit because, as you can imagine, the place is chock full of historic fascinations. Charles I stayed here, and later so did his mortal enemy Oliver Cromwell. King James I planted a mulberry tree in the garden which is said to still bloom to this day. I know, what were the chances of coming across a second 400-year-old mulberry tree in such quick succession after the last episode? Honestly, they're like buses. You wait 6 or 7 years and not a single 400-year-old mulberry tree, and then 2 turn up at once. But with the amount of things this house has seen, I'm amazed that the current owners claim that it is not, in fact, haunted. And that is even more surprising given that a century ago, workers excavating the cellars unearthed the skeleton of a young girl in the stairwell. I don't mention if the residents from a century ago experienced any phantom activity after that shocking discovery, but if it really is all quiet on the paranormal front at the old manor these days, then it must be one of the only ancient buildings in England that isn't supposed to be haunted. Of course, none of that explains why so many of Knaresborough's buildings are painted like chessboards. Some think that a previous owner of the manor just really loved chess and wanted to proclaim his love of the game for all to see. Others claim that the design first appeared during the manor's time as a cafe and was intended to make the building visible to passing visitors in need of refreshment. Either way, as we can see from our parking spot by the river, other buildings in the area decided to follow suit, creating just one of the quirky Knaresborough traditions that make the place so interesting. Not unlike their famed bed racing event, in which once a year teams of athletes tear through the town across parkland, up hills and down the gorge, pushing beds on wheels, culminating in an icy dash right through the river. It's certainly a town blessed with many fascinating curiosities, but neither of these things is what really put the place on the map and caused people all the way down the centuries to utter its name with slight trepidation and wonder. No, that accolade goes to Mother Shipton, the prophetess of Yorkshire, and that is whose story we have come here to learn today.
As we leave the car park and start uphill through the woodland trail that follows the river below, we're actually walking along an 18th century promenade called the Long Walk that was created by Henry Slingsby. Yes, another Slingsby, after inheriting the site from an even earlier Slingsby who had bought the land from King Charles in 1630. The promenade had been a popular walk since even before that time though, with multiple mentions of the mineral spring being written about by travellers and diarists right back from the 17th century, when it started being promoted as a tourist attraction by the Slingsby family. But the very earliest reference to the well goes back even further, to the time when the area was still owned by the reigning monarch, and for that fascinating little window through time, we have to thank King Henry VIII's antiquarian John Leland. Once a royal chaplain and library keeper for the king, in 1533, just 3 years before the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII commissioned Leland to explore all the libraries of the religious houses of England and document their significant or unusual books. 5 years later, with the monastic houses of England disbanded, Leland ventured out on explorations of a different kind, describing himself as being, in his own words, totally inflamed with a love to see thoroughly all those parts of this opulent and ample realm. So that's what he did, setting out on a 6-year journey around all parts of England and Wales, recording as he did so all the memorable, notable and unusual topography, antiquities and even some very early attempts at a kind of archaeological surveying. What he did was unprecedented. It amounted to one of the first, if not the first, local history and travel guides of England, and although his notes were never published in his lifetime, in fact not until the 18th century, his journals, or his itinerary as we now know it, gives us a fascinating glimpse into the Tudor world. And amongst the places he visited, one location stands out as truly unusual: Knaresborough and its mysterious petrifying well. Leland describes the well in his notes from 1534, using the name as it was known in those days, the Dropping Well.
A well of wonderful nature called Dropping Well, for out of the great rocks by it distilleth water continually into it. The water is so cold and of such a nature that what thing soever falleth out of the rocks into this pit, or is cast in or groweth about the rock, and is touched of this water, groweth into stone, or else some sand or other fine ground that is about the rocks.
Later 17th century writers and diarists also describe in wonderment the petrifying effect of this mystical well that turned ordinary objects into stone. English travel writer Celia Fiennes wrote of the strange effects of the well in her journal in 1697.
And this water, as it runs and where it lies in the hollows of the rock, does turn moss and wood into stone. I took moss myself from thence, which is all crisped and perfect stone. The whole rock is continually dropping with water, besides the showering from the top which ever runs, and this is called the Dropping Well.
The effect is actually one of mineralization rather than magic, of course. The water emerges from an underground lake and seeps through an aquifer in the Earth's crust, rising through a layer of porous rock and accumulating a heavy load of all sorts of dissolved minerals as it goes, including calcium carbonate, sodium and magnesium amongst others. In much the same way as stalactites and stalagmites in caves form, so does the mineral-rich water over time coat everything in its path in a crust of calcite rock. Of course, hundreds of years ago, before people really understood the effects of mineralization, this well that could petrify things into stone must have seemed otherworldly. In fact, the guidebook claims that Tudor residents of the town thought that if they came too near the well, they'd be turned into stone too, or a spell would be cast upon them. So it's no wonder then that this mysterious petrifying well that just happens to sit next to a small dark cave burrowed into the face of a steep gorge is also said to be the birthplace of the legendary prophetess, and some say witch of Yorkshire, Mother Shipton.
And we come face to warty face with her for the first time as we ascend the wooded slope towards the dropping well and her cave. A tourist signpost shaped like a giant open book displays an 18th century engraving of the prophetess, and she looks exactly like a storybook witch. She's old and haggard, with staring eyes, a hooked beaky nose, and a pointy, upturned, warty chin. She's hunched and crooked-backed, and is wearing a tall black pointed hat. A quintessential cackling witch, from a time before that image was a worn-out Halloween trope. In fact, I have to wonder if she might be, if not the origin of the stereotypical Wicked Witch image, then at least a great proliferator of it over the last few hundred years. The first written description we have of Ursula Sonthale, as Mother Shipton's maiden name was, comes from 17th century writer Richard Head, who published a pamphlet of Mother Shipton's Prophecies in 1684, along with something of a biography. He describes the soothsayer in vivid detail, going to great lengths to express how extraordinary her countenance was, including quite an excessive amount of detail about her nose for some reason.
She was of an indifferent height, but very morose and big-boned. A head very long, with very great goggling but sharp and fiery eyes. Her nose of an incredible and unproportionable length, having in it many crooks and turnings, adorned with many strange pimples of diverse colours as red, blue, and mixed, which, like vapours of brimstone, gave one such a lustre to her affrighted spectators in the dead time of the night, that one of them confessed several times in my hearing that her nurse needed no other light to assist her in the performance of her duty. Her cheeks were of a swarthy complexion, much like a mixture of black and yellow jaundice, wrinkled, shriveled, and very much hollow, insomuch that, as the ribs of her body, so the impression of her teeth were easily to be discerned through both sides of her face, answering one side to the other like the notches in a valley, excepting only two of them, which stood quite out of her mouth, in imitation of the tusks of a wild boar, or the tooth of an elephant.
So, not just a warty nose, but a glowing nose? The description goes on, adorning her with crooked legs, a crooked back, a crooked neck. The poor woman didn't have a straight bone in her body, according to her less than generous biographer. He also writes about the strange and inexplicable things that would happen around Ursula when she was a child. But first, we need to rewind a little and pick up where we left off, with Ursula's mother just having given birth to her in a cave during an unearthly storm. According to the legend, her mother Agatha had retreated to the cave in the woods when the townsfolk of Knaresborough shunned the girl for refusing to name the father of her unborn child. And here she stayed with her baby girl for another 2 years, raising Ursula in Knaresborough Forest, the plants and animals forming the girl's first experiences and friends. But after a while, an abbot from a nearby monastery intervened, maybe thinking that a cave was no place for a child to grow up, which sounds kindly enough, but in fact his decidedly unkind solution was to separate mother and child, leaving baby Ursula with a nursemaid in the village and carting poor Agatha off to a convent, where she died only a few years later. It's said that to begin with, things went fine with nursemaid and infant, but soon enough, all sorts of strange things started to happen. One day, the nurse had been out of the house and returned to find all the doors and windows flung open. Thinking she'd been burgled, she ran to her neighbours for assistance, and a small group of them all entered the house together with some trepidation, worried that they might find the intruders still within. Intruders they did not find, but as they entered, a cacophony of noise erupted like a concert of cats wailing, which set them all off running back out towards the door. But they found they could not leave. Some invisible force, described as like an unseen turnstile, physically barred their way and prevented any one of them from exiting. When finally they were released, they had to steel their nerve to re-enter and find out what on earth was going on, because baby Ursula was inside, alone with whatever was causing the disturbances. As soon as they stepped foot back into the house, there was another eruption of noise, this time like the sudden noise of footsteps on stone, although the home only had an earthen floor. A snatch of music followed from out of nowhere, and then all fell quiet. They turned the house upside down, but could not find the child, until one of the party happened to look up the chimney, and there was the girl, in her crib, lodged some 3 feet up the chimney. As if this disturbing event wasn't enough, the nurse started to encounter something like poltergeist activity around the house. The chairs and stools would move around on their own accord. Food would go missing off her plate right in front of her eyes, and sometimes the child herself would seemingly vanish at will, the nurse growing frantic looking for her, only for Ursula to reappear entirely unperturbed, as if she'd never been missing at all. As she grew up, the townsfolk saw that, as odd as they thought she was incredibly bright and could apparently read without ever having been taught. Her intelligence didn't stop people mocking her for her different appearance, though, and she would regularly find insults thrown her way. But the perpetrators quickly became aware that those causing the girl offence would often mysteriously come a cropper themselves before long. Feeling a pinch or hair pull from an unseen hand, tripping over some invisible obstacle, or finding themselves inexplicably tongue-tied and unable to utter a word. Needless to say, the girl became an object of some fear and wonder. But to get away from the jibes and insults, Ursula retreated to the forest where she was born. It became her refuge, and some say that she took after her mother and used her sharp intellect to learn the healing powers of the plants that grew there. Certainly, in her adulthood, the townsfolk started coming to her for advice. She seemed to have an uncanny knack for knowing things that she should have no way of knowing, and sometimes could even seem to affect people in strange ways. One day, a neighbour sought Ursula out, very upset, as somebody had stolen the woman's brand new linen smock and petticoat, which were expensive things in those days. Ursula comforted the woman and told her not to worry. She said she knew very well who had stolen the smock, and she would make sure that they returned it. She directed her neighbour to simply stand by the town cross on the next market day and await its return. The woman probably thought that Ursula was just going to have a stiff word with whoever she suspected, but what happened was not quite so ordinary. Market day came, and Ursula's neighbour situated herself next to the town cross as directed, wondering what was going to happen. Before long, she saw a young woman weaving through the crowds towards her, brazenly wearing the stolen smock and holding the petticoat in her hand. Like a puppet directed by an unseen hand, the young woman headed straight for Ursula's neighbour, singing out loud in front of the whole town. "I stole my neighbour's smock and petticoat. I am a thief, and here I show it." At which the woman, blushing furiously, handed over the stolen goods, curtsied awkwardly, and left, leaving Ursula's neighbour gaping in surprise.
At the age of 24, Ursula got married to a carpenter called Toby Shipton, giving her the surname we are all so familiar with today. And although some of the more unpleasant members of the community whispered about how she must have bewitched him into marriage, for a while they were very happy. But sadly, Ursula's contentment was not to last. After only 2 years, Toby Shipton died, causing of course yet more rumblings for the rumour mill. But the truth was, in Tudor times, the average life expectancy was pretty short, and daily life meant running the gamut of things that could put you in an early grave. Ursula, on the other hand, lived a very long life for the time, her great age earning her the nickname Mother Shipton, despite not having any children, the name being in deference to her uncommon 70-plus years. It's said that she predicted her own passing at the age of 74, and that she returned to the cave in which she was born when she knew her time was coming close. But before that time, she made a string of prophecies that would end up being told all over the country and be passed down through generations. Of course, some of her prophecies were quite close to home, involving events that would come to pass in her local area, such as this one that must have set people talking when it was borne out.
"Water shall come over Ouse Bridge, and a windmill shall be set upon a tower, and an elm tree shall lie at every man's door."
Tradition says this relates to the time that York installed its first piped water system. The water did indeed pass over a bridge across the River Ouse via pipes, with a windmill drawing up the water. It's even said that the pipes were made from small hollowed-out elm tree trunks due to the wood's special properties, meaning it would not rot from being constantly wet. And people marvelled at how old Mother Shipton could have foreseen this wonder of technological advancement that many could not have dreamt of only a few years before. She also predicted the collapse of York's Trinity Church steeple.
"Before Ouse Bridge and Trinity meet, what is built in a day shall fall in the night, till the highest stone of the church be the lowest stone of the bridge."
Which all sounds very cryptic and a little like an impossible riddle, but when the church steeple did collapse in a tremendous storm one night, floodwater from that same storm also swept away part of the bridge. When the bridge was rebuilt, the builders reused some of the stone from the fallen steeple, thus taking stone from the highest point of the church and building them into the foundations, or you could say lowest stones, of the bridge. Mother Shipton lived through the reigns of 4 different monarchs: Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I, which means she lived through some politically turbulent times. Henry VIII in particular made waves that had massive implications for the people of England when he became set on annulling the marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, ostensibly because she had not borne him a male heir, but we all know that he also had his eye on her lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Well, apparently Mother Shipton knew that too, and she could foresee the far-reaching consequences that the king's roving eye would have.
When the cow doth ride the bull, then, priest, beware thy skull. And when the lower shrubs do fall, the great trees quickly follow shall. The mighted peacock's lofty pride shall to his master be a guide, and one great court to pass shall bring what was never done by any king. The poor shall grieve to see that day, and who did feast must fast and pray. Fate so decreed their overthrow, riches bought pride, and pride bought woe.
I know that may not sound like it has anything to do with the king or his ushering in of the Reformation, during which the Crown of England broke from Catholic leadership in Rome. But the animals in this rhyme are said to refer to the animals that appeared on the family crests of Henry and Anne. In Anne's case, a bull, and in Henry's, a cow. The lower shrubs are said to have represented the smaller religious houses, and the great trees, the larger, more prosperous monasteries. Because when Mother Shipton said, "Then, priest, beware thy skull," tradition tells that she was prophesying the dissolution of the monasteries, as that was ultimately what happened when Henry didn't get the annulment he wanted from Catherine, and he did in fact start off by suppressing the smaller religious houses in the first wave, before moving on to closing all the large ones in a second final blow. In those days, the Crown of England was Catholic, and as such, Henry VIII had to play by the rules of the Catholic Church, meaning he had to ask the Pope of Rome if he would allow Henry's marriage to be annulled. But the Pope said no. Henry, however, wasn't going to take no for an answer, and the next few years were messy and complicated. Henry married Anne in secret anyway. Of course, this caused huge problems with the Catholic Pope in Rome, who excommunicated the king. Henry VIII declared that he didn't need the Pope anyway, and made himself head of the Church of England instead.
And one great court to pass shall bring what was never done by any king.
Indeed, at the time, breaking from the Pope and the Catholic Church in Rome would have been shocking. England had had ties to Catholic Rome since the 6th century. That's nearly 1,000 years. What Henry did must have been almost unthinkable to most people. The king also declared that as he was now in charge of the church, that meant he must also own all the land and property owned by the church, and set about claiming it for himself, in what we now call the dissolution of the monasteries. Although in fact it wasn't just monasteries, he closed monasteries, priories, convents and friaries all over England, and stripped them of their wealth, goods and even building materials. And this is where that last part of Mother Shipton's prophecy comes in.
The poor shall grieve to see that day, and who did feast must fast and pray. Fate so decreed their overthrow, riches bought pride, and pride bought woe.
As we've discovered in our many travels around England, in medieval times and right up to the Reformation, these religious houses provided most of, if not all, the poor relief for their local area. They gave food and shelter to the poor and often ran hospitals for the sick. When the help they provided disappeared overnight, many towns struggled to provide for those less fortunate in their community, and had nowhere and no one to care for their ill and vulnerable members of the community. The poor certainly did grieve to see that day, not to mention the 10,000 monks, nuns and friars who were suddenly out of a job and a home. To many communities, the closures certainly did bring much woe. You may wonder why Mother Shipton talked in such riddles, and maybe even whether the seeming vagueness of these rhymes have just made it very easy for people to read meaning into them that may have not been there in the first place. Well, possibly, but it's important to remember that writing contentious prophecies about the king in the 16th century would have been considered an act of treason, and that was an offence punishable by death. In fact, Henry VIII even explicitly wrote a law decreeing that any slanderous writings about him be deemed a treasonable offence, so it would only be sensible to somewhat obscure prophecies about the king in metaphorical language. And talking about metaphorical language, who on earth was the mitred peacock supposed to be? Actually, this mitred peacock appears a few times in Mother Shipton's prophecies, and it's quite clear in her writings that she was referring to the notorious Cardinal Wolsey, who she doesn't seem to have had a very high opinion of.
Truth be told, many of his contemporaries didn't have a very high opinion of Cardinal Wolsey, or at least they resented his power, high taxes, and ostentatious displays of wealth. Wolsey moved quickly up the royal ranks after becoming Henry VIII's chaplain, collecting numerous job titles as he gained influence and power, including Royal Almoner, Bishop, Archbishop, Cardinal, and eventually Lord Chancellor. This last title put him in the position of the King's chief advisor, and in fact he wielded so much power in court that many people thought him to make more of the King's decisions than the King did himself, earning him the nickname Alter Rex, meaning Other King. So it's not surprising that he pops up in a few of Mother Shipton's prophecies about Henry VIII. But she also had something very specific to say about Wolsey's ultimate downfall, which, so the legend goes, the Cardinal got wind of, and he didn't like what he heard. Unfortunately for Wolsey, Henry VIII had charged him with the task of getting his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, and as we already know, that did not go well. Wolsey's failure to get the Pope to agree to the annulment led to the Cardinal's fall from grace. No longer Henry's right-hand man, he was stripped of all his offices and wealth and relegated to a sort of retirement in his role of Archbishop of York. Wolsey seemed determined to make the best of it, though, and was hardly planning a quiet retirement and a simple life of religious servitude. A contemporary recorded how Wolsey was determined to be installed at York Cathedral with all possible pomp and circumstance. And to that end, he had instructed a throne to be erected there, described as such a height and design as was never seen before. So, when he heard that Mother Shipton's latest prophecy predicted that the Cardinal may see York, but never reach it, he got very miffed indeed. Wolsey sent off 3 lords to meet with a gentleman in York who was to take them to see Mother Shipton and relay the message that Wolsey was determined that he would in fact reach York, prophecy or not, and that when he did reach the city and install himself as Archbishop of the Cathedral, he would have his revenge for her spreading dire prophecies about him and would burn her as a witch. Lovely fella, eh? I can see why he wasn't so popular. So, the Duke of Suffolk, Lord Darcy, and Lord Percy dutifully toddled off to York and found a man called Mr. Beasley who could direct them to Mother Shipton's house. Knocking at her door unannounced, they were surprised to hear her reply from behind the closed wooden door. "Come in, Mr. Beasley, and those 3 lords you have brought with you." How could she have known who they were? She had no warning of their coming. Perhaps there was more to this oracle than they first supposed. Thinking that as she seemed to have been expecting them, maybe she knew their business there too, they were even more surprised when she bid them to sit and take refreshment by the fire with her. "But," one stuttered, "if you knew why we were here, you would not be so welcoming. Cardinal Wolsey heard that you said he would never see York, and has sent us to tell you that he will make it there, and when he does, he intends to put an end to you." "Well, I see no reason to hang the messenger," Ursula said calmly, and with that she whipped off the linen handkerchief she wore over her snow-white hair and threw it into the blazing hearth. The fabric, that should have caught fire immediately, stubbornly refused to burn. After a few moments, the woman added her wooden walking stick to the flames, but it too steadfastly refused to catch alight. "There now," she said. "If those had burned, then I might have too, but they did not. And I didn't say that the Cardinal would never see York. I said he would see it, but he would never reach it." As it happened, Mother Shipton was right to have no fear of the flames. Wolsey travelled towards York to take up his marvellous new throne at the cathedral, stopping off at Coward Castle some 10 miles to the south of the city. He was so close to his destination now that from the tower of the castle he could see York in the distance. Seeing the cathedral spire on the horizon, less than a day's travel away, he thought he had outwitted the Witch of York, and that it wouldn't be long before he had his revenge. But on the 4th of November 1530, a rather unwelcome guest arrived at the castle. You see, Wolsey had been pretty upset about King Henry taking away all his wealth and power, and had sent some rather indiscreet letters to his friends complaining about the king and the injustice of it all. And as we mentioned earlier, bad-mouthing the king was a treasonable offence. Just 2 days before Wolsey's big shindig installing him on his shiny new throne as Archbishop of York, the Earl of Northumberland arrived to arrest Wolsey on charges of high treason. His letters moaning about the king had been intercepted. So it seemed he never would make it to York after all, or sit on his expensive throne. And on the long, arduous journey down to London, where he was to be held prisoner in the Tower and await his execution, he became gravely ill and died en route during a stop at the Abbey of Leicester. All of this happened in Mother Shipton's lifetime, but her prophecies certainly weren't limited to her own age. Many people think that she predicted the start and the consequences of the English Civil War.
Having been travelling around Britain seeking out spooky places for nearly 7 years now, it always strikes us how few of the places we visit have gone untouched by the Civil War. It seems every place in the country still bears a scar or two from the conflict, and Knaresborough is no different. As we crest the top of the rise on our woodland walk, we're almost to the point where we're standing directly above the petrifying well. We can see the little stream on our right where the mineral-heavy water bubbles up from deep within the earth, passes under the footpath we're walking on, and flows over a rocky outcrop on our left that drops down to the famous well below. But the first thing you see when you reach the top of the rise is a cannon, just casually dropped by the side of the footpath, which is a little confusing. But all is explained on an information board, noting that, just above us a little further up the hill, was once a cannon emplacement used by parliamentarians in 1644, when they laid siege to Knaresborough Castle. At that time the castle was owned by King Charles I. Now, I'm sure you'll remember all about him from the last episode, and how he got on the wrong side of Parliament in a series of rows that ended up causing the whole country to take sides in the first of 3 civil wars. Well, the people of Knaresborough stayed loyal to the crown throughout the Civil War, and as such Knaresborough Castle became a royalist stronghold, and Charles had placed a garrison of royalist forces there. The castle was in good condition, its Norman foundations having been largely rebuilt in the 14th century, and from its excellent position high on the promontory overlooking the river Nidd, it was considered almost impenetrable. But in the November of 1644, the parliamentarian forces started a barrage of cannon fire upon the castle, setting up the guns in the area just above where we're currently standing on the Long Walk, on a rise called Gallows Hill, firing the cannonballs right over the dropping well, across the river to the rocky cliff where Knaresborough Castle stood strong. The Royalist forces resisted for 3 long weeks of siege before parliamentarians penetrated the castle walls, and Charles's forces had to surrender. Just another blow to the king's army that eventually resulted in the fall of the monarchy. Despite this all happening well after Mother Shipton's time, some people think that she did in fact prophesy the English Civil War, with the lines,
"Then wars shall begin in the spring, much woe to England it shall bring. Then shall the ladies cry well away, that ever we lived to see this day. Then best for them that have the least, and worst for them that have the most."
Well, the war certainly did bring England plenty of woe, and with the monarchy being on the losing side, resulting in the persecution of all the crown's rich courtiers in the following years of Parliament's rule, you can see how some might think that the fall of the royal court might well be reflected in the lines,
"Best for them that have the least, and worst for them that have the most."
Did the Civil War begin in the spring? Well, that's a tricky one, and it depends on who you ask and how you measure the start of the Civil War. Would you count Charles I fleeing London? Or when the 2 opposing sides first mustered their forces? First battle? Or perhaps the first time parliamentarians marched on York? All of these things happened at different times, and who knows what the soothsayer from the 16th century would have considered to signify the start of the war. But the part of the prophecy that really sealed the deal was this line.
"And king or queen shall there be none, but lords to rule this realm alone."
England had been under royal rule since the Anglo-Saxons, a span of about 700 years. Did Mother Shipton really predict the fall of the monarchy nearly 100 years before the formation of Oliver Cromwell's new model army? I wonder if she foresaw Knaresborough Castle, which would have stood strong, proud and impenetrable in her day, reduced to the fragmented ruin that it is now, having been slighted, meaning basically blown up by the victorious parliamentarians who wanted no reminders of their royalist enemies, and subsequently picked apart by townsfolk for building materials. According to Haunted Castles of England by J.G. Montgomery, 2 ghostly apparitions have been seen in ruins of the castle, locked in an eternal struggle. The unexplained figures seem to be engaged in combat, one lying on the ground as though knocked down, the other standing over him, one arm raised as though about to strike a final deadly blow. Could these phantoms be replaying the last moments of that siege from over 300 years ago? Our guidebook also tells us that the forest itself is haunted, and to listen for the shuffle and snap of unexplained movements in the shadows of the trees. Maybe these spirits are just some of the 400 parliamentary troops who came into the woods to stage the attack on Knaresborough Castle. Or maybe they date from a much, much older time, all the way back to when that rocky promontory is thought to have held an Anglo-Saxon fort. It's a little hair-raising to stand there and imagine 17th century cannonballs whooshing over our heads towards the ruin of the castle across the river. And we can't help but keep an eye on any little flicker of movement between the trees, ears pricked for the sounds of ghostly soldiers shuffling in the brush. But all we hear is the tinkling of water, spilling over the edge of the gorge into the mystical well below. And we can barely contain our excitement any longer, rushing down the flights of steps to reach the petrifying well and Mother Shipton's cave.
The first flight of stairs leads down to an ivy-covered wall with 2 open doorways through it, and, on the left, a little stone building that I guess was probably once a ticket office, as this is where we start to descend to the level of the river and the main event. Through the doorways we get our first glimpse of the dropping well and the river beyond, through swaying boughs of hanging ivy and the dark green-needled branches of an old gnarled yew tree. The musical tinkling of the water intensifies as I traverse the steps, and I feel like I'm descending into an elven grotto. And all of a sudden, there is the famous, mysterious, petrifying well. A rounded rocky crag juts out from the face of the gorge, like the giant head of some great beast, mouth open and maw gaping below. The stone is banded in vertical stripes of lighter and darker brown, gleaming slickly from the moisture of the mineral-laden streams tumbling over the top. And it's easy to see from the undulating surface where they have built and carved channels and ridges over time. The overhang has been formed entirely from mineral buildup, just like a massive wide stalactite. And, just like a stalagmite, the water hitting the ground below has caused rocky growth to build upwards, creating a little stony pool that the water rains down into prettily. Behind the curtain of water cascading down the overhang, a craggy cavern scoops back into the face of the gorge, covered with velvety mosses and lichens in every shade of green any artist could ever hope to find in a palette. The verdantly dressed layers and folds of rock creating fairy cities and cathedrals of moss. Suspended from the trickling overhang is a long string hung all the way along the length of the well from one end to the other. From it, a multitude of objects dangle in various stages of petrification. A doll and a teapot that are early on in their mineralisation journey and are still bright with colour. A hat and rolling pin that have become the same grey as the cliff. A boot and some now utterly unrecognisable grey lumps that have been dangling so long they have sprouted their own colonies of moss and look for all the world like they have grown organically from out of the gorge face itself. And lots of tiny teddy bears on long vertical strings, some still fluffy, others starting to show the first grey fuzz of their crystalline transformation. These apparently are usually sold in the gift shop, so you can take your own petrified teddy home with you, but there were none for sale that day. It's absolutely magical. I'm as captivated as if I had been transported to an actual fairy grotto. And with the gorge hiding all signs of modern life on one side and the river smoothly flowing on the other, it really does feel otherworldly. No wonder this place has come to be associated with the most magical, mysterious resident of Knaresborough. Further along the cliff face, tucked away in a little corner you might easily miss if it weren't signposted, is a little hollow that goes right into the rock. This is the Wishing Well, a tiny little cavern, only big enough for one person at a time, where the water seeps and trickles right through the cliff and collects in a little bowl deep within that has been formed by the movement of the water over hundreds, probably thousands of years. This is what they call the Wishing Well, and apparently it has been tradition to dip your hand in the pool and make a wish here for hundreds of years, since the Slingsbys first started charging for tours way back in the 17th century, in fact. Well, I'm not going to break a tradition of 400 years, so I read the instructions on the information board carefully before entering, as there are apparently some rules, and the sign warns that you must follow them carefully. You must dip your right hand in the water and make a wish. Don't wish for money or harm to others. Keep the wish a secret. Be careful what you wish for, it might just come true. And lastly, leave the water to dry naturally on your hand. I enter carefully through a rock crevice screened with thick strands of hanging ivy, feeling a little like a kid going to visit Santa's grotto. Ducking inside the sloping ceiling, I see the little pool lit from below with an ethereal glow that changes colour from purple to red to green and blue. Some people may think it tacky, but I'm fully invested in the magic at this point and utterly buy into the magical grotto idea, LED effects and all. The little well, or pool, is about midway up the cavern wall, almost like a font, and I drop down to my knees to place my coins in the water, an optional, not essential step, according to the sign, but all ultimately given to charity. I reverently dunk my right hand into the water and make my secret wish, so taken up in the moment that I don't realise I'm actually dunking my entire cardigan sleeve into the pool, wicking up the magical water like a sponge and emerging dripping up to my elbow with damp knees from the soggy floor. I hope Mother Shipton didn't think I was being greedy and trying to take the well water home with me, but I paid penance for it anyway, with a cold and soggy arm for the rest of the trip, having assumed that the rule about allowing your hand to dry naturally now also extended to my cardigan on this chilly autumn day. And then, finally, we reach Mother Shipton's cave itself. This cave formed in exactly the same way that the dropping well has, layers and layers of minerals building up over thousands of years and creating a massive overhang with a cavern behind. At some point, though, the mass of rock became too heavy and some of it collapsed, diverting the path of the water from Mother Shipton's cave to the place it flows from now over the dropping well, a few metres away. In fact, the only reason the same thing doesn't happen to the dropping well is that the rock face is manually scrubbed every few months to prevent such a build-up of minerals. The legends about Mother Shipton's birthplace all seem to tell of a dank, dark cave, and I suppose that is mostly just because it fits the theme of the story. But today, we find the cave quite dry and airy. Small, yes, but as soon as you're within its enclosed space, you notice the relative warmth from being out of the chill wind, and the sound-deadening effect of the thick stone walls makes the noises of the outside world fall away. And to me, at least, it seems quite cosy. There is a feeling of quiet respect here too, though, even reverence. It's a little like the expectant quiet of a church, and maybe some of that is down to the statue of Mother Shipton situated at the back of the cave, hunched and haggard just like in the stories, leaning heavily on a walking stick, her head bowed and her features in shadow, but something about her giving you the impression that she's keeping a beady, canny eye on all those who enter her domain. The statue is sculpted out of a grey, craggy material that blends in perfectly with the natural surroundings, and just a small backlight giving her a slight yellowy halo and lending a warm, comforting light to the cave. We both instinctively bow to the small, hunched figure who made such huge waves in the old world, and whose words still reverberate through time. Publications of her predictions being sold from this very site as far back as the 17th century, making Mother Shipton's Prophecies one of the oldest tourist souvenirs that you can still buy from the same site today. And even now, people reading that same book of prophecies that I stand in the cave clutching in my still damp hand might marvel at how some of those rhymes hint at a modern world that must have been impossible to imagine for someone born in the 15th century.
Carriages without horses shall go, and accidents fill the world with woe. Around the world thoughts shall fly in the twinkling of an eye. Through hills man shall ride, and no horse be at his side. Under water men shall walk, shall ride, shall sleep, shall talk. In the air men shall be seen, in white, in black, in green. Iron in the water shall float, as easily as a wooden boat.
And in one line that caused great upset in years to come, she predicted the end of the world.
As we drove into Knaresborough and crossed the river over what's known as the High Bridge, we passed a whitewashed oak beam pub perched on the edge of the river bearing the sign, The World's End. Another one, we asked ourselves, so soon? This inn, however, got its name directly from Mother Shipton's most notorious prophecy.
The world to an end shall come in 1881.
Hang on a minute, I hear you say? She clearly made a bit of a fluff on that one, didn't she? I mean, here we still are, and although some days it does feel a bit like the world might actually be ending right now, it has been chugging on for a good 100-odd years since 1881. Well, you would be right. And in fact, that's not her prophecy. In an odd little twist, her most famous, most repeated prophecies, the world ending in 1881, the carriages without horses shall go, iron floating, thoughts flying, all that last rhyme basically, was actually made up by an author called Charles Hindley in 1862. It turns out that over the years, many of the authors who republished the 50 or so versions of Mother Shipton's prophecies heavily embellished her actual predictions and often added their own. In fact, the whole biography of Ursula being born in a thunderstorm, the strange events happening to her nursemaid, and even the exhaustive physical description of her was made up by a not at all well-respected author called Richard Head in 1684, who was rather notorious at the time for his writings having a strong tinge of indecency. Certainly for poor Ursula, he invented a biography of her life that inserted all kinds of controversial and even salacious details, and basically turned her into an unholy child of the devil, not to mention inventing a particularly unlikely but somewhat hilarious scene in which Ursula wreaks revenge on a group of yeomen shouting insults at her by magically making one man's ruff turn into a toilet seat, another's hat transform into an upturned chamber pot, and their landlord, who comes thundering upstairs to see what the uproar is about, to become stuck in the doorway due to having inexplicably sprouted a pair of majestic horns. All of which had the men dissolve into helpless laughter and uncontrollable farting. Yes, we can see why Mr. Head didn't earn himself the best reputation as a writer. But it did of course sell copies. Sensationalism is not a modern invention after all. But out of all the flamboyantly embellished versions of her oracle, none caused quite as much fuss as Charles Hindley's end-of-the-world prediction for 1881. Apparently this prediction, along with the rhyme about horseless carriages and whatnot, had been published in the popular Notes and Queries journal in the mid-19th century, rejuvenating the legend once again. How quickly this circulated, or whether the prophecy pamphlets were still being widely published at the time, I don't know, but there were apparently sufficient numbers of people panicking that the end was nigh that the British Library saw fit to commission author William H. Harrison to delve into the British Library archives, rootle out all the versions of Mother Shipton's prophecies that he could find, and pick apart the fraudulent prophecies from the original ones. Harrison, who interestingly was a spiritualist author, duly conducted a thorough search of all the source materials he was able to lay his hands on to get to the bottom of the prophecy that was causing such distress. But, in fact, he didn't need to look far to debunk the main culprit. It turns out that scallywag Charles Hindley had admitted to making up the prophecy about the world coming to an end in 1881 via a letter to Notes and Queries, the same journal that had published it not long before. A note from the editor in the 1873 edition states,
Mr. Charles Hindley of Brighton, in a letter to us, has made a clean breast of having fabricated the prophecy quoted.
So, what about the other prophecies then? Luckily for us, William H. Harrison was serious in his research, ferreting through the archives to find the earliest edition of Mother Shipton's prophecies that the British Library Archive held. And what he found was that most of the republished copies borrowed heavily from Richard Head's supernatural thriller version from 1684. And so Harrison felt with some certainty it was safe to discount all the devilish additions that he had embroidered, as well as the oddly overzealous details about her glowing nose. But going back further still, he found what is widely considered the oldest, most original, and possibly first chapbook publication of the Soothsayer's Oracle, published in 1641 by a London printing press. This version had no biography, no physical description of a hunchback woman with a warty nose, and nothing predicting planes, trains, and automobiles. It was just a collection of various prophecies, such as the ones mentioned earlier in our journey today regarding Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey, the Civil War, and the local predictions about the water system and the Ouse Bridge. It's a rather jumbled collection, some more detailed than others, many written in a disjointed, non-rhyming manner, but that is honestly more what you would expect from the handed-down words of a Tudor elder, rather than the rhyming couplets of the 17th and 18th century fakers. But even this was published 80 years after her death, so you might well wonder whether Mother Shipton ever existed at all.
The modern-day prophecy book, sold as a souvenir to 21st century visitors like us, makes a point of reminding us that it is all too easy for our modern minds to overlook the power of the spoken word. And I tend to agree. In today's society, if something isn't written down in triplicate, it may as well not exist. But in Mother Shipton's time, a large percentage of the population wouldn't have learnt to read or write. Books were incredibly expensive and few and far between. The printing press had only existed in England since the late 15th century, just a few years before Mother Shipton was born, and its use was not widespread to begin with. In those days, local traditions and knowledge of all kinds were learned, remembered and passed down generation to generation orally, and that's the way it had been for thousands of years. And it seems that this oral tradition played a large part in the survival of the Yorkshire oracle's prophecies. The 1641 chapbook begins with the following inscription.
A true copy of Mother Shipton's last prophecies, as they were taken from one Joanne Waller in the year of our Lord 1625, who died in March last 1641, being 94 years of age, of whom Mother Shipton had prophesied that she should live to hear of wars within this kingdom, but not to see them, also predicting other wonderful events that should befall in this climate and in these times.
The possibility that Mother Shipton could have related her predictions to a young Joanne Waller, who then remembered the oracles all through her life and into her late years, then passing them on to the next generation in a tradition as old as time, is tantalizingly possible. As is the possibility that details about her life, her place of birth, and her stories and predictions were held in the collective memory of local legend for generations. But we may well have a little evidence too. A 1537 letter from Henry VIII to the Duke of Norfolk may just contain the first written reference to Ursula Shipton over 100 years before the first chapbook was printed. In this letter, the king cold-bloodedly encourages the Duke to enact martial law in response to a northern rebellion, and gives the Duke a list of people to off in a horrible manner as an example to other would-be rebels.
You shall send up to us the traitors Bigod, the friar of Knaresborough, Lech, if they may be taken, the friar of Penrith and Townley, late chancellor to the Bishop of Carlisle, who has been a great promoter of these rebellions, the Witch of York, and one Dr. Pickering.
Could Henry have been referring to Mother Shipton? Could he have become aware of her through her predictions about his former right-hand man, Cardinal Wolsey, 7 years earlier? Maybe he'd even heard some of her prophecies about him and his carousel of wives. Given that so many of her original prophecies concern King Henry VIII, it does feel eminently possible that this letter could be a little glimmer of proof that the oracle really did exist, and in fact had made quite a name for herself. And that didn't end in the 16th century. The publication of her prophecies in chapbook form seems to have rocketed her to 17th century stardom, a fame that has, in one way or another, persisted to the present day. The chapbooks became so widely known that people all over the country quoted her prophecies and considered her image to be the symbol of all things mysterious. One source that seems to confirm her widespread notoriety comes from the famous 17th century diarist Samuel Pepys, who recounts his conversation with a Navy commissioner in his diaries written during the days of the Great Fire of London. The commissioner describes the experience of a fellow sailor aboard a royal ship when the news came that London was burning.
He says he was on board the Prince when the news come of the burning of London, and all the Prince said was that now Shipton's prophecy was out.
What he was referring to was the following prophecy.
When these things are come to pass, a ship shall come floating on Thames, until it come against London. Then shall the master thereof begin to weep, and his men shall say, Master, why weep? You and we have had so good a voyage. For that, will he say, I have seen here the goodliest city in the world, and now I fear there is none to give us drink for our money.
It's pretty incredible to think that someone in London would have made a connection to the Yorkshire Oracle's prophecy at that time, 25 years after the first prophecy book was published. But it just goes to show how much her words had taken hold in hearts and minds, and if she was in fact predicting the Great Fire of London, she was not wrong. Along the stretch of the river Pepys' friend had been navigating, there was not an inn or a house left standing. The fire had razed everything to the ground. Another source that tells us how synonymous the image of her as a hunched, crooked old hag had become with the occupations of mystery and prediction comes from Daniel Defoe, writing in 1722. He was writing a semi-fictional account of the outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1665, likely based on the journals of his uncle who had lived through it. And within these pages, Mother Shipton, or the image of her at least, makes an appearance.
These terrors and apprehensions of the people led them into 1,000 weak, foolish, and wicked things. And this was running about to fortune-tellers, cunning men and astrologers to know their fortune, or, as it is vulgarly expressed, to have their fortunes told them, their nativities calculated and the like. And this trade grew so open and so generally practised that it became common to have signs and inscriptions set up at doors. Here lives a fortune-teller, here lives an astrologer, here you may have your nativity calculated and the like. And Friar Bacon's brazen head, which was the usual sign of these people's dwellings, was to be seen almost in every street, or else the sign of Mother Shipton.
And so her image persists through time. Today, some think we can still see her influence in the pantomime dame, based partly on this 18th century Yorkshire rhyme.
Of all the pretty pantomimes that have been seen or sung in rhymes, since famous Johnny Rich's times, there's none like Mother Shipton.
Which would mean that the spirit of old Mother Shipton may well be being kept alive by thousands of adults and children yelling, "Oh no, she didn't!" in the stalls of packed theatres all over England every single Christmas. It would appear that her likeness even made it into several museums and even Westminster Abbey in the form of wax effigies, presumably rather like an early Madame Tussauds. A museum in Fleet Street, London had not only her image in waxwork, but also claimed to have her real skull taken from her grave in Yorkshire. Even more perturbingly, the author of a letter to Notes and Queries seemed to imply that one of her wax likenesses may have been haunted when they said,
"She was an especial favourite with the juvenile visitors, as she used to put out her leg and kick the shins of anyone who approached her near enough."
Blimey, that's not going to help my phobia of creepy museum mannequins, is it? William H. Harrison, our investigative spiritualist, discovered a 1663 engraving of Mother Shipton that may have been the very first to represent her as a hunched, haggard, beaky-nosed and curly-chinned old woman, albeit minus the pointy hat. Instead, she wears on her head a linen handkerchief, just like the one she threw into the fire during her visit from Cardinal Wolsey's Lords. Harrison remarks how much of a resemblance this 1663 engraving, and indeed all the others that seem to have descended directly from it, look remarkably similar to the Punch and Judy puppet character Punch, even going so far as to include a side-by-side image comparison in his debunking publication. And I have to admit, the similarity to the traditional Punch character every Brit my age or older will remember is uncanny. Has the caricature of Mother Shipton been living on in Punch and Judy puppet shows all over the country for decades, if not hundreds of years? And yet, Harrison also found a picture of Mother Shipton in the earliest printed pamphlet from 1641, and she didn't look very witch-like, or Punch-like, or haggard at all.
The cover of the earliest pamphlet extant in relation to Mother Shipton, namely that dated 1641, has a coarsely executed alleged likeness of her on the front page. The artist seems to have had no deliberate intention to make her especially ugly. She has no hooked nose, hump, or abnormal dress. The portrait would equally well have done for Queen Elizabeth or any other respectable woman of about Mother Shipton's time.
It seems such a shame that the version of Mother Shipton that has endured so strongly is the sensationalised caricature. But perhaps if none of that embellishment had taken place, her prophecies wouldn't have carried on being republished for hundreds of years. Her image wouldn't have become synonymous with mystery and prophecy, and we would have lost her story altogether. And that would be a terrible loss indeed. As we come to the end of our journey, I find myself circling back to the warning right at the beginning of the park's guidebook. A warning not to be too dismissive of the spoken word. And I think it's a very pertinent reminder. We live in an age where we're bombarded with information from all angles 24/7. And sadly, it is a necessary skill of modern living to be discerning, scrupulous, and sometimes downright sceptical about how much of that information we can believe. But we mustn't let that take away from us the rich history of local traditions or of oral storytelling, and we mustn't become so jaded that we can't appreciate the innocent magic of dipping a hand in a wishing well, or believing in a wise old woman who lived in a cave and new things that had not yet come to pass. Thankfully, the owners of the park, where the dropping well continues its perpetual flow into the elven pool below, have managed to capture some of this magic and atmosphere, and the mystery of Mother Shipton lives on. She lives on in the memories and imagination of all who visit. She lives on in the wings of a native butterfly named after her. And, according to an information board in the park, although there was once rumoured to be a gravestone in her name just on the outskirts of York, local tradition tells that when she died, her friends secretly buried her in an unmarked grave somewhere in Knaresborough Forest, so that no one would disturb her rest and she could stay in the forest she loved so much forevermore. So maybe she also lives on in the park in a very real way, absorbed into the soil under our feet as we walk down the stunning beech tree avenue, autumn leaves twirling down around us like bronzed snowflakes, as we head to our last stop at the gift shop to buy our little glass souvenir bottles of wishing well water. And personally, out of all the traditions, that's the one I hope is true most of all. But of course, we have one last question to answer. Did she ever actually predict the end of the world after all of that? Well, yes, she did. Or at least the earliest chapbook we have of her prophecies did. But unlike Hindley's made-up verse plucking the fateful year out of thin air, she related the end times in terms of her own local area, foreseeing that the world would end when the High Bridge of Knaresborough, the one that the World's End pub so fittingly sits on, had fallen 3 times. History tells us that it has already fallen twice, but as of right now, it's looking pretty darn solid and sturdy, so I don't think we need to worry too much about it falling anytime soon.
And that, I'm afraid, is the end of the episode. We hope that you all have a wonderful Hallowbirthdayween and that you'll join us again next time for another Knock Once for Yes.